For 13 days, the world was on the brink of total catastrophe. For 13 days, the clock was minutes from midnight. For 13 days, the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly claimed the lives of millions. This is the tale of those events. Nikita Khrushchev had found out that American missiles were stationed in Turkey, a member of NATO. He wanted to position missiles in Cuba to have the same first strike capabilities as the U.S. He sent some Soviet missile experts, accompanied by an agricultural delegation, to Havana. The experts gained a meeting with Fidel Castro, who, expecting a second American invasion to come soon, strongly agreed with the idea of installing missiles in Cuba. In September of that year, 85 commercial ships arrived in Cuba holding ballistic missiles and 42,000 Soviet soldiers. On October 16th, Kennedy, the president of the U.S. at the time, and some of his advisors looked at blown-up photos of the missiles arriving in Cuba. JFK's advisors tell him that if the warheads for those missiles are installed, they could hit Washington in minutes if launched. Understandably, Kennedy is unhappy with Khrushchev due to his betrayal. Now you see, Kennedy had drawn a line with Khrushchev, saying that if Khrushchev stationed missiles in Cuba, he'd take action against the Soviet Union. He drew this line expecting not to have to take action, but in life, not everything turns out how you'd expect it. So what will Kennedy do? Will he start a war? Will he try to negotiate? Find out next time. I'm just kidding. I'm about to tell you everything that happens right now. For free. I know. What a deal. After analyzing the photos, the analysts agree that as soon as the missiles have their warheads attached, they'd be ready to strike within hours. There was some hope, though. It was believed that the warheads weren't on site yet, meaning that Kennedy still had some time to plan. Kennedy's advisors agreed that the U.S. could win a nuclear war against the Soviet Union, but Kennedy mentioned how even a victory would still mean millions of American deaths. But now, a Soviet officer in Cuba announces that there are 8 medium-range missiles that are armed and can hit Washington in minutes once launched. The clock ticks 1 second closer to midnight. Kennedy schedules a television broadcast for 2 a.m. Moscow time, but plans to send a message to Moscow an hour before. The message arrives, and it turns out to be an ultimatum. The 14 Soviet ships that are bound for Cuba with nuclear missiles are about to be hit by an American blockade stationed around Cuba.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
That was a part of the 3-minute broadcast that Kennedy made to the public. Everyone now knew that the situation was extremely dangerous and that war could break out at any moment. Kennedy called the blockade a quarantine as a legal dodge because if he called it a blockade, it would be an act of war. Kennedy delayed the blockade a day to seek international aid, and so one of the Soviet ships was able to get to Cuba. This meant that the Soviet missiles now had warheads and were fully operational. But the next day, Kennedy signs the order, which puts the quarantine into effect. There was a problem, though, because Kennedy's advisors disagreed on how to enforce the quarantine. The Navy thought it was simple. Just stop any ships that try to enter Cuban waters. If they don't stop, then fire. Kennedy is shocked at this because if American ships fire at Soviet ships, it could cause a war. Kennedy says that there must be no firing on enemy ships unless authorized by Kennedy himself. After some time of anxiously waiting, the Soviet ships headed for Cuba turn around and head back to Europe. Kennedy receives a message from Khrushchev pleading for there to be no war between the Soviet Union and the U.S. Recon planes discover that the missiles in Cuba are entirely operational and could hit Washington in just 10 minutes. A nuclear apocalypse could now be caused by the push of a button. The Cubans see a plane, most likely a recon plane, flying over Cuba. Their aircraft missiles could hit it, and so they ask their general whether to fire or not. He, however, is asleep, so they decide to shoot. The missile hits, and the plane's debris comes crashing down onto Cuba. The first shot of this conflict has now come, but how many more will there be? Now, obviously you know that a full nuclear war does not occur because you and I are still here and very much not dead. But there can still be some suspense, so just pretend you don't know the ending and you're scared that war will break out. Cool? Anyways, the Soviets say that if the Americans take their missiles stationed in Turkey away, then they would do the same. This proposition seems very reasonable, but Kennedy's advisors say it would break NATO by trading away the safety of Turkey for their own. A Soviet submarine is underneath an American ship and is now being bombarded by grenades from that ship. All of a sudden, a depth charge hits the hull of the sub. The captain believes that this means war has broken out. He wants to launch one of his nuclear torpedoes. In these subs, you normally need 2 people to authorize a nuclear attack. The captain and another member of the sub says yes, but Commander Vasily Arkhipov also gets a vote and he says no. This stops the launch and also saves the world. Arkhipov saved millions of lives that day by just saying one word, no. Thanks, Vasily. Kennedy gives an offer to the Soviet ambassador. America will accept the pledge to never invade Cuba publicly, but the deal to get rid of missiles in Turkey will be kept quiet. If they accept the deal, though, the missiles in Turkey will be gone in 5 months. Once the message arrives in Moscow, Khrushchev agrees to it, along with the rest of the Soviet Council. The U.S. gets the message and celebrates the crisis successfully averted. It's now about time to let these world leaders get some sleep, don't you think? This might have been the closest the world has ever come to World War III, and I hope that it never comes this close again. The world has mostly learnt its lesson from this crisis, but I'm not sure if everyone fully understands what happened in those 13 days. But at least, now you do. The end.